So I'll be talking about time perception in relation to depression on the left hand and action on the right hand. There's no good pictures for action, but I think Arnie basically beats everything, right? Okay, that's my name. So time flies when you're having fun is something everybody knows. You might also say that time dies when you're not having fun. I came up with that, copyright. And in fact, many psychiatric disorders, including depression, can be characterized by having temporal disturbances. So people with depression quite often, and this has been well known for almost a century, that they feel stuck in time. So this might be just a coincidence. Maybe it's because they're not having fun and this somehow makes them stuck. But it might also be possible that that temporal disturbance has something causal in relationship. So maybe if you help people coming out of being stuck in time, maybe you can help them with depression. So I'll be talking a little bit about the psychology of time perception, which is something very few people know about, and also very few psychologists, in fact. Then I'll be talking about my effects, discovery, so to speak, that imaginary action alters time perception, induces kind of a temporal illusion. And I found out with some CloudResearch funding now that this effect is associated with clinical symptoms of depression. So to start with, time flies, and why does it do it? According to the most famous model in time psychology, it's because there's a pacemaker accumulator organ, so to speak. So basically a watch inside the brain. It works by having a pacemaker. This is an actual pacemaker. And an accumulator, which basically picks up the paces from the pacemaker. But only if the attention is engaged in a task of keeping time. So when you're asked to keep time, for example, now 10 minutes, the attention switches towards time perception and accurately picks up the paces. Now, supposedly, emotions such as depression, for example, might cause arousal, and this arousal increases the speed of the pacemaker. Thus, more ticks seem to be accumulated, and thus people seem to be having a temporal disturbance. But the problem with this view is that this has been tested quite a few times, and there's absolutely no evidence for it. So what's going on? So my idea is slightly different. Instead of having this kind of internal organ, I'm saying that perceived time is a consequence of action. So it's not a perceptual organ, it's an action organ, so to speak. That is to say that any action from, say, getting some coffee yields a consequence. If you go get coffee, at some point you have the warm feeling of coffee in your hand. And this in turn leads you to drink coffee. So there's a kind of a temporal order to things. And these kind of events happen in time. And from this, we might be able to learn time. So time is a consequence of movement, of ourselves moving in space. Now, my idea is that if you change the action to perception, so for example, you will bump into somebody, then perhaps your timing gets disturbed. Now, in this kind of view, you might say that emotions change time, not just because emotions are feelings, but emotions also have action consequences. If people are happy, they move more. So this might then result in the time perception differences. To test this, I have a classic experiment, and you can engage in it as well. It requires you just to count the length of a video. So basically, I'll show a video, and I count to 3, and then count, if you're alone, you can count aloud, otherwise mentally, the duration of the video. At some point it stops. So 1, 2, 3. And it stops. Okay. Now keep this answer, remember it, and do the same thing, but now imagine yourself walking slower and slower, maybe. So again, I'll count to 3 and then start counting. 1, 2, 3. Okay, now I hope that you estimated more or less the same length of 2 videos. In fact, the second one was a little bit longer, but because people imagine going slower and slower, they tend to also to count slower, and basically they respond to it slower. So that's the idea. In my experiment conducted online, I have people do this verbal estimation task. It works exactly the same. People are asked to imagine going faster and faster, walking slower and slower, or not doing anything, and then just to count the duration of the video. They're not told how long it is, but it's 7 to 16 seconds. And they fill it in. It's a very simple task. So there are 3 conditions of mental imagery. And there are 2 visual conditions as well. And let's do this. People think that it changes time perception, but basically it doesn't. Or sometimes it does a little bit, but rarely. So the idea, this is more or less the result. And the results as I've observed them before, is about if people are asked to imagine running faster and faster, they estimate longer time intervals. It's very significant, it's a very nice effect. And if they imagine walking slower and slower, they have longer time, shorter time estimates. So basically I did the same experiment, except now I asked people to fill out Beck's depression inventory, which is a very standard inventory of depression. Get the same thing, this is a slightly different figure. It is again the same effect. With running faster and faster, more seconds are counted. So motion imagery again affects time perception, and symptoms of depression, however, didn't show any effect on the number of seconds counted. So there was no absolute time difference. The question is then, is there a relative time difference? And yes, there is. So I found that people with a higher Beck's depression inventory are more affected by this motion imagery than normal people. Mainly in the slower and slower condition. That's why I had it now in the demonstration. So if you were counted very few seconds in the second. No, not at all. Of course, it's a kind of a significant correlation, but it doesn't immediately tell you anything without repeating it over and over. So symptoms of depression alter the effect of motion imagery, and depressed individuals show a stronger effect of the slower motion. That's more or less it. So in conclusion then, depression seems to increase this kind of temporal illusion. And I say again that time perception is not just some sort of internal clock, but it relates actions to perceptions. And emotions may affect the sense of time because emotion affects movements. So for example, you're jumping with joy and sadness is related to lethargy, so on. And this might also explain why physical exercise interventions have been shown to help in depression sometimes. I'm also interested now in further research whether there's some sort of role in dopamine. Anybody knows dopamine is everyone's favorite neurotransmitter because it's involved in reward, so in emotion, but also in movement. For example, people with Parkinson have slowed down motions. That's my cat. Very excited in the evening. And finally, dopamine is also related. So this kind of combines everything together, emotion, movement, and time. That's basically my research. I'm also interested in whether mental imagery treatments might somehow be effective, and if there's some sort of relationship with mindfulness. For example, if people are imagining going slow over the different parts of the body and feeling everything one after the other, And basically they're imagining it going slower and slower. Right? So this is somehow related.
I have a quick question. I was just wondering about, like, are you, I guess, like, can you say more about your model, theoretical model about how time perception relates to depression? Like, are you thinking that it caused, like, it may be a contributing cause to depression, or that depression causes, you know, what's the causal direction there?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Honestly, without doing an intervention, it's very hard to say, of course. So there are two possibilities. One is that time perception itself would be causal, which I think would be the most exciting thing, because it would be really a game changer for clinical psychology, so to speak. But it seems also very possible that that depression causes the lethargy and the emotion, and this in turn causes the differences in time perception. That's the most obvious explanation.
And then there was another question in the chat, whether you see any potential from the results of your study for reducing time pressure on students or workers. I'm not 100% sure what the meaning of that is. So Joanne, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, so as a graduate student, I always suffer from time pressure. So I always think like, oh my God, time is so short and time fast, really, like time is super fast, things like that. And I'm also like studying mindfulness, and actually I am like interested in looking at like how mindfulness can be helpful for those like who are suffering from time pressure, especially graduate students, things like that. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on potential applications to reduce people's suffering, like due to the time pressure?
Yeah. Well, you might indeed try to consciously slow down movements. That causes you to have a different idea about how much time passes. For example, when I'm brushing my teeth, it's very boring. It takes 2 minutes, and every 30 seconds, my toothbrush gives a little bzz, like 30 seconds have passed. Now, what works if you try to go as slow as possible through tooth by tooth, like a dentist, then it seems to go. You know, if you count at the same time, you get fewer seconds counted. So, you know, it's kind of the opposite of time pressure in a way. It's more like time. You want time to go fast, and it doesn't. But then, so presumably, yeah, I don't know how it works with time pressure, but at least become a dentist anecdote.
Yeah, I think really the answer to that question is there's just too much that grad students have to do, and it's not a matter of perception, it's a matter of like actual, you know, there's a lot of stuff that is on our plates. I could say that as a grad
That's
student.
certainly true.
So, hi, my name is Art, and I'm a PhD student at Syracuse University. First, I wanted to thank CloudResearch for awarding us this grant. This is a project that I've been really excited for years, actually. And so CloudResearch's funding actually made it possible for us to actually collect this data. And then I also wanted to thank my collaborators at Syracuse University. So fellow grad students, Alexandria Henrique, and then Mackenzie S., and then also my secondary advisor, Sarah Burke. So what we've done is we used AI to create a database of realistic face stimuli. So specifically, we created a database of faces that differ by their race or ethnicity, so that we have manipulations for experiments. So it's not uncommon for social scientists to use photos of human faces as stimuli in their experiments. So for example, there's a very well-known study conducted by Keith Payne where participants were primed with a white man's face or a black man's face followed by an image of either a gun or a tool, and that was to study weapon misidentification. And then often when planning studies like this, researchers will use validated stimulus face databases, such as the Chicago Face database, which is a popular database with photos of men and women who differ by race, which is very similar to what we're trying to do here. So the Chicago Face database uses photographs of real people, but other databases use artificial computer-generated faces. And the type of face that researchers use for their experiments, and whether they're real or artificial, each one comes with its own trade-off when used in experimental research, which I will very briefly cover. So for real faces, there's less control over confounds. So when presenting participants with a white face or a black face, there might be differences between the two in general facial structure, general build, maybe differences in general attractiveness, subtle differences in pose, things like that. But the benefit is that these faces should be perceived by participants as faces of real people because they actually are. And then for artificial faces, it's generally the reverse. So there might be greater control over confounds because you have the ability to take the same face and morph it into different versions. So for example, at the bottom of this slide here, you can see differences in masculinity and femininity. And then on the right side here, you can also see skin tone manipulation. But then also they tend to not look quite real. So it's less clear how applicable the results from studies using these might be to real world contexts. So we wanted to address the limitations of both type of database. So we use StyleGAN2, which is a novel AI framework that can be used to generate artificial faces of people who don't actually exist, but who look very real, like the face on this slide that was generated with StyleGAN. And so StyleGAN2 is developed by NVIDIA and it's freely available. So anyone who has a little bit of coding knowledge and then who meets the hardware requirements can actually use it. But most importantly for us in our project, StyleGAN2 allows for what its developers called style mixing, which basically allows you to mix the characteristics of two different faces that you've generated. So we can start with one face and then we can mix it with another face and then generate a third face that carries on characteristics from either of the first two faces. And if we want to, style mixing allows us to choose to modify only characteristics like skin tone, hair texture, and then make some other subtle changes to facial features. So like the two images on this slide here, we can create two versions of the same face that are very similar, except they should appear to differ in race or ethnicity. And then it also allows us to try and manipulate racial prototypicality so that we can have not only faces that are perceived as, say, white versus black versus any other race or ethnicity, but a spectrum of sorts so that we can have faces that are perceived as multiracial or at least that differ in racial prototypicality. And then as for our process, we use StyleGAN2 to generate thousands of face sets. That's how we started. And then we used style mixing to create different versions of each face set that we hoped would appear to differ in race or ethnicity. And then we selected the sets from these thousands of face sets that we believe might work best for our race and ethnicity manipulations, while also trying to allow for some range in the database for attractiveness, age, and then some differences in facial expression. So then we crop the images down to just the face pretty close to try and hide the clothing as much as we could. And then we removed these StyleGAN backgrounds, which can be a bit abstract, and replace them with gray neutral backgrounds. And then so that we would have data on how these faces are actually perceived, this is where the CloudResearch Grant comes in. We had participants rate our final images primarily through Connect, but also we supplemented a little bit through MTurk. So we ended up with a final sample size of 1,586 participants, which with each participant rating 10 different images. We made sure that no participant saw 2 images from the same face set. And then for each face, participants indicated what they believed that person's race or ethnicity was through a multiple choice option, so they could select multiple races or ethnicities. And then for each face that they chose, afterwards, they would then identify how prototypical of that race they believe that person to be from 0 to 100. And then they also indicated for each person what they believe their age to be, their gender to be, and then they rated them on their attractiveness and their happiness. And then at the end of the survey, we also had them identify which of the 10 images that they were presented with that they believed were artificial, if any. So we're still exploring the data, but we plan to make all of our images and the accompanying data available to any researchers who want to use them for free. And so after we removed faces that were either rated a little too high in artificiality or that participants weren't able to see due to a survey error, our current database has 284 faces across 61 face sets. So each set representing essentially a different person that was then manipulated to have different versions of race or ethnicity. And then we had an average of 4.7 faces per set, and then it ranged from as low as 2 all the way up to 10. So eventually researchers will have access to the versions that were rated by participants, so the ones that were cropped to the face and then have the gray background. But we also want to allow them to also have access to the uncropped transparent versions. So the versions that you also see on these slides here and there. And then finally, we're going to make sure to include the parameters that were required for generating these faces so that anyone would be able to take this information, use StyleGAN2, and then recreate these faces and also possibly modify them themselves. So here's a brief example of the kind of data that we're going to make available to researchers. For each face, we actually have complete data for any races that faces were perceived by participants. So it's not just Black like in this example, but I just wanted to use that for a quick example. So we have, let me turn on my handy little laser pointer here. So we have race perceptions at the top. So this is basically the percentage of participants who indicated that they believed this person belonged to this race. So in this case, we have Black. So we have 94% for the left image and 82% for the right image. And then we have the prototypicality numbers. So that is how prototypical they believe that person to be of that race. In this case, again, Black. So on the left here, the average out of all participants who saw this person and then indicated that they believed that they were Black, the average was 88. And then for the right image, the average was about 57. And then again, we have data like the perceived age. So for the left person, the average was about 35, for the right about 37. And then ratings of attractiveness from 1 to 7. So 4.8, 4.6, happiness, 5.5, 4.9. And then the artificiality, which is basically the percentage of participants who saw the face and then indicated that they believed that they were artificial. And for these two examples that I selected, nobody felt that they were artificial. So again, a brief example of the kind of data that we have. We are going to make much more data available to researchers so that they can go through the database and they can choose the faces that they believe will work best for the actual research that they're conducting. So for future directions, so first we want to write up a manuscript about this and we want to submit it to a methodology journal. So that's kind of our next step after we take a little bit of a deeper dive into the data. But we might also want to add some more face sets eventually to the database so that we can focus on a wider range of races. So while we did include faces that might be perceived as, say, East Asian, we primarily focused on faces that we believed would be perceived as white and then Black and then in between in terms of prototypicality. So we wanted to have faces that were perceived as multiracial to start with. But looking through the data at first, we definitely have faces where a large number of people indicated that they perceive them to be like Latino, Hispanic, or East Asian, and so on. So then another thing a bit off in the future that we might want to play with, we might want to work with other characteristic manipulations. So this is other stuff that is possible to do in StyleGAM. So I have an example here of age, where I was playing around a little bit and I was able to, with StyleGAM, modify someone's age. I think that would be useful for certain researchers. And then also something like weight as well. So we've been able to play around with the face and manipulate the weight that they have. I don't have example images for it, but also we can do something with modifying facial expression, at least making a smile larger or smaller, and then even doing gender manipulation. So manipulating whether someone appears to be, say, more or less masculine or feminine. So that's another thing that, another direction we might go to in the future. So that was a very brief overview of what we're doing. I wanted to make sure I got through it in time for any questions. So yeah, with whatever time I have left, if anyone has any questions, I can do my best to answer them. Thanks again to CloudResearch and everyone here for listening. And if your question isn't answered, you can, of course, also email me at admarsd@syr.edu.
Yeah, so I'm Nick Bird. I'll be presenting some work that I've been doing with Simon Cullen and Philip Chivkovsky. So one of the motivations for this research has to do with debiasing or critical thinking or improving people's thinking, things like that. So imagine how people do often rely on faulty intuitions. There's various tests in decision sciences that have been developed to kind of reveal this, right? So if you're familiar with Kahneman or Tversky or the Thinking Fast and Slow literature, you're kind of aware of some of these tasks. They're designed to trick you. And it's kind of surprisingly difficult to get people to overcome these faulty intuitions that they tend to have on these kinds of tasks. And so today I wanted to present to you a platform we've developed to help people to think more reflectively on tasks like that, but also we're kind of interested in applying it to broader tasks, and I'll allude to that towards the end of this talk. So the platform is called Socrates, and I meant to start this a second ago, but you'll be seeing a time lapse of that on your screen now, hopefully. People are going through this platform, taking some comprehension test questions to make sure they understand what's about to happen, since it'll be different than a typical survey. And the key thing that we're doing with this survey is making sure that we can study not just individual decisions, but also group decisions, namely decisions that are made after people have a chance to kind of interact and talk and chat about it. And one of the great things about this is that we've designed it to seamlessly interface with platforms like CloudResearch, and it'll even manage things like performance bonuses, so that basically people enter it the same way they would a typical survey and then come back to whatever payment platform they would, and then you would get information about who to assign bonuses to and not. So it really streamlines things in a way that would be very difficult to do without the platform. And one of the key results is that it does seem like Socratic discussion could be among the most potent ways to help people think more critically about these kinds of tasks in the heuristics and biases literature. So let me quickly go through some of what I'm talking about. So this is an adaptation of a task you might be familiar with known as the Wason selection task. And apparently I've just given away the answer accidentally, but if each of these cards has a number on one side and a gray or black color on the other, then which two cards would you need to turn over to falsify the statement? If a card shows an even number on one side, then the opposite side is black. So the correct answer are the two cards that are pulsing, but many people seem to be drawn to choosing the black card as one of the options, and the idea seems to be that they're trying to confirm rather than falsify the proposition in question. Here's an adaptation of a test, I guess a question that goes back to Kahneman and Tversky. This was adapted for the intelligence community by people like Frank Stech and Philip Hewer. And so the question is, look, there's two different types of fighter jets in the area that have, different frequencies, and a U.S. pilot identifies a fighter jet as one of them, and this pilot's about 80% accurate. So what's the probability that the jet is what the U.S. pilot thinks it is? And the correct response is actually 40%, but many people seem to neglect the base rate of the particular fighter jet they think they've witnessed when trying to determine the probability. So this is called a base rate neglect task. So here's another one about belief bias. So if all rich people are CEOs and Jeff Bezos is a CEO, would that mean that Jeff Bezos is rich? And the conclusion seems totally plausible because you probably know about this person named Jeff Bezos, and you probably think, among other things about this person, they're rich. And so you probably think the argument's fine, but that would actually be a logical fallacy known as affirming the consequent, at least if you're drawing that conclusion from these two bolded premises we're giving you. So these kinds of tasks are used to measure reflection because they lure people towards a particular response that, upon reflection, they can realize is incorrect. And it is very difficult to get people to perform better on these tests. So this is a preprint from Yilmaz and Isler showing all of the various interventions that they've tested over the years, over, I think, thousands of participants. And it shows that the most effective way to get people to improve on this test was literally to teach them how to solve the test. So that you tell them the various biases that these tests use to trick you and how you can overcome those biases. And that is really the only thing that had to seem to have a standout impact on people's test performance in terms of improving it. There's lots you can do to make people perform worse, but it's hard to make them perform better. And unfortunately, there's another paper recently showing that teaching people or giving people feedback to improve their performance on reflection tests doesn't seem to translate beyond the domain of reflection tests themselves. So this might not be a very generalizable method for getting people to reflect. So why is it so hard to get people to reason reflectively? Well, one reason might be what you call this individualist research paradigm, right? So we're studying people completing tasks on their own rather than with other people who can bring alternative views. And, there's financial incentives for participants, but also for researchers for these tasks to be completed as fast as possible, right? So that the participant can make as much money as possible and so that the researcher can pay as little as possible. So the problem is this means that we're systematically less likely to be studying reflective judgment if we're doing these brief online surveys. So the first solution could be to realign incentives around reflection, and the second solution could be to confront people with alternative views that they might not otherwise realize or reflect on. And so one thing you might do is try to combine those two solutions into one, which is a bit of sort of like what we're doing here. So big picture, we get participants' initial judgments about a problem. Then we let them reflect on the problem either on their own or with another peer who disagreed with them. And then we offer some participants a financial bonus for getting a better answer. So the problem with this experimental design is that it's extremely tedious to do this in person, right? You'd have to schedule people to come in at the same time and then somehow randomly assign people to sometimes talk to the people that come in at the same time as they do, and then not assign everyone to that kind of condition. Distributing the financial bonuses is kind of, tedious. Doing this online is even more challenging because there's not very many platforms that allow this to be done efficiently and quickly, certainly not as easily as you could try to run an experiment, say, with Qualtrics or something like that. So our goal was to provide a solution that would be about as easy as a Qualtrics survey, but with much more powerful intervention. So we developed this platform that can study both the solitary types of reasoning that we're used to studying, but also this kind of interactive reasoning I've been talking about. So unlike the in-person discussion experiments, this kind of automates and scales everything so that rather than taking, days, weeks, months, however long it would take to get to the sample size you need, you can get it in an afternoon, sort of like you can with a typical MTurk or CloudResearch or Prolific or, insert your favorite cloud work platform. So you can get your data quickly, and it'll be relatively easy. And so participants who disagree can be paired up in real time to discuss their responses. And if pairing doesn't happen within a certain amount of time that you as the researcher set, then participants would be able to figure out the problem on their own in a sort of individual version of the discussion condition. And then we offer some participants a financial bonus for getting the right answer. So in one of the bonus conditions, the far left in green, we're actually offering what we call a cooperative bonus. So that is, in order for you to earn the bonus, not only do you need to get to the better answer by the end of the intervention, but your partner also has to agree that that's the best answer. So you both have to get to that better answer. So you have some incentive to sort of either convince your partner or maybe become open to your partner, depending on whether or not you think you're correct. So these are the three basic conditions. So ask yourself, which one of these things do you think is going to improve people's decisions the most? One, writing down reasons for each response option on a given task, chatting with someone who gave the other response option on the task, or one of those first two options, but with a cash bonus for the right answer. So I'll give you the results task by task, and then we'll kind of look at the aggregate. So with that WASON card selection task I showed you a moment ago, discussion was much more likely to change people's responses to the best response. So discussion conditions dramatically improved, made people more likely to change the better response after the intervention than trying to reason on their own. And then with this base rate neglect task, where there's a probability you have to calculate based on base rates, very, very few people got this correct initially, and they were very resistant to changing their mind. However, in the cooperative bonus or collective bonus condition on the very bottom, they were dramatically more likely to change their response to the better response compared to really any of the other conditions. And the neat thing about this platform is we're getting these transcripts from, in the individual condition, you kind of write an essay where you consider both sides of the situation. And in the discussion condition, you're actually talking to another person who represents the other side of the other response option. And so we get all this rich text, which allows us to get inside the black box of what people are thinking, so to speak. And so one thing to notice here is that somebody did give the incorrect, or what people call the lured response on this task, but they're kind of offering reasons. And on standard, maybe ordinary people's definition of reflection, they are reflecting, right? They're kind of thinking through the problem and offering some reasons. But their other participant is reflecting on something that's crucial, and that is the base rate, and then kind of doing the math for them. And that seemed to help them change their mind. And so on a standard interpretation of a reflection test, the person in red, Smith, would have been dubbed unreflective, even though they were doing some reflection. And so this, kind of maybe challenges our standard interpretation of reflection tests, but also shows how reflection can unfold in a group. So back to that belief bias task about Jeff Bezos, the results for this look very much like they did for the WASON card selection task. Discussions definitely outperformed in terms of getting people to overcome a faulty response. And bonuses didn't seem to make much of a difference, like they didn't seem to make much of a difference in the WASON card selection task. And again, when you look inside the black box, you see that somebody gave the so-called lured or unreflective response, but was kind of offering reasons for it. So they would have been labeled unreflective by the standard test interpretation, but they were, in a sense, reflecting. Fortunately, their partner kind of added some reflection on maybe some important details. In this case, they're offering a counterexample, which seems to be something that some participants do and is one of the quickest ways to help somebody realize an error in their thinking. And because we have access to these transcripts, we can actually kind of quantify all of the various properties of these transcripts and then use that to see which properties of transcripts predict correcting your faulty intuition if you had a faulty intuition to begin with. And the two things that are sort of standout predictors of overcoming a faulty intuition are reconsidering your initial response, like simply just saying, wait a second, is that right? Or demonstrating some open-mindedness, so trying to look for reasons for the other response. So not just stepping back from your initial response, but saying, like, why would somebody say that other thing? Like, what reason might they have? And so those two things were the strongest predictors. And in a paper that preceded this research, I actually argued that those two features would be the two factors that are most likely to help, that are constituent of reflection. So if I were a less dispassionate scientist, I suppose I'd be extremely pleased to see this result. So one thing you might wonder is, like, those were all tasks that had demonstrably correct and incorrect answers. What about tasks that don't necessarily have demonstrably correct and incorrect answers, like philosophy tasks? So here's a philosophy task where somebody comes to a true belief, but in a way that is sort of accidental, or what you might call not justified, or something like that. And so the question we're asking is, if someone arrives at a true belief but accidentally, does that belief count as knowledge? And in philosophy, the orthodox answer is no. And discussion seemed far more likely to get people to that answer, even though they don't know what philosophers' orthodox response is. They just had their own view and then got to talk to somebody else about it or try to figure it out on their own. And discussion seemed to get people to be closer to what philosophers think. So now what happens if you aggregate the data from all four tasks into one? Well, what we find is again, discussion seems to dramatically outperform the other conditions in terms of getting people to change their response to the correct or best response, as opposed to changing to the worst, which, a small minority of people do actually do. So discussion seems to be the main winner here, as opposed to, say, figuring it out on your own or even cash bonuses. And one thing that we like about this is that reasoning in the real world is kind of social and dialogical, right? And increasingly online as remote work has increased in precedence. And so we're kind of hoping that this will help research go towards more realistic reasoning settings, as opposed to the kinds of things that we have people do when we ask them to click on a survey within the MTurk framework and then in complete isolation complete a survey and use that data to understand how real world reasoning works. So we're hoping that this platform will kind of get us a little bit closer to what real world reasoning looks like, and therefore increase the validity of our research. One thing I just wanted to mention on the way out is, you've probably heard it a million times today, but we have developed some of our own tools in addition to the tools that CloudResearch offers to control for data quality. So in this task we say, hey, could you just describe what probably happened right before this photo was taken, or explain what happened? And bots and people who aren't very proficient in English, or people who aren't paying attention very much, they'll often just describe the photo like, this man is angry, as opposed to explaining it like, this man's favorite sports team just lost the game. And so this is kind of a nice, short, easy way to distinguish kind of low quality data from other data. And when we use tools like this, we found that Amazon Mechanical Turk had significantly more junk in it than other platforms and even undergraduates. And this is even when we control for the amount of completed tasks that participants had and their acceptance rate. So we're controlling for kind of worker qualifications. I've got a bunch of other reflection projects in the pipeline I'm happy to talk about. I'm pretty sure I'm out of time, so I'm sorry that there's no questions, I'm guessing.